So after years of not actually reading Hunter x Hunter, I finally caught up with it. I was stuck on Greed Island for the longest time, but it wasn't because it didn't interest me at all. It was specifically because there was no actual rush to catching up, because there hadn't been a new chapter in years at that point. But with it actually coming back, I felt more obligated to actually sit down and read it. I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a massive Hunter x Hunter fan. I'm not completely obsessed with the series, although I do really enjoy it, and everything about it is just amazing, and it's probably one of my top 10 animes of all time. But if you were going to ask me any specific detail about it, I'm probably not going to be able to provide that for you. But I have rewatched the 2011 anime quite a few times, and it's definitely one of those shows that I just never get tired of and want more and more content from. Which makes it kind of weird that I hadn't actually sat down and read the manga. Although I do watch some YouTube content around the newer chapters, I never actually had the drive to sit down and read it. But spoilers never bothered me about like the Succession War arc, just because I wanted to know it, but I didn't necessarily want to spend my time catching up to a series that more than likely wasn't going to get new content anytime soon. But since it's finally come out of hiatus, I felt like it was probably the best time to actually sit down and read through the entirety of it. For right now, I'm not really all that interested in talking about the earlier stuff in Hunter x Hunter, specifically everything prior to the Chimera Ant arc, mainly because when I decided to actually sit down and read it, I didn't restart the entire series, and I just continued from where I was, which was more towards the beginning or middle of Greed Island, so I don't really have much of that and the previous content on my mind right now, so I would probably want to go and reread all that or rewatch it to at least refresh my memory if I wanted to sit down and like actually make a video over the entirety of Hunter x Hunter. I might do that at some point, but probably not, considering there's already infinite videos about that stuff that do a far better job than I ever could. But who knows, maybe one day. But for right now, there's just a couple early things that I wanted to talk about before actually getting into the post-anime stuff. And none of my friends have actually read Hunter x Hunter yet, so why not make a video so I can at least have some discussion? There's just a few things with the Chimera Ant arc that I wanted to talk about really quick. The first being that the anime and the manga are completely different with the introductions to Kite and his team, and just the start of the arc in general. I think that's the only major difference between the manga and anime, with the anime being a lot more serious and the gravity of the situation being a lot heavier, I guess, where like it immediately throws you into the action and they're immediately in danger. And they make it so Kite isn't really as familiar with Gon in that one, whereas the manga makes it seem like Kite and Gon have known each other for quite a while and actually remembered each other, because they did have something really early on. In the anime it seemed like Gon had forgotten until he saw Kite again, but with the manga it's immediately made clear that they do remember each other, and then Kite invites him and Killua into their like research group, and it's a lot more laid back approach to the Chimera Ant arc rather than just throwing you into the deep end. I think the manga in general does it a lot better, but you don't really get that weight of the situation and the severity of what's actually about to happen until they actually make it to the NGL and go through everything. But yeah, I did think the manga did it slightly better. With taking time to actually sit down and read through the manga, I realized Gon's current position really bothers me. Like, he hardly had any repercussions for gaining all of the power it took to avenge Kite. You can argue that all of the guilt and the pain that he had to deal with throughout the entire arc adds to the punishment, but him being unable to use Nen currently because of it isn't remotely a punishment for the amount of power he actually had, and he's basically a child that throws a tantrum and then gets put in timeout for a little bit. I really don't think the punishment was very fitting. He basically threw away everything for a single moment of that power, just to very quickly be cured and achieve all of his goals, and he got to spend time with his dad, and then he just returns home to his lovely aunt. Oh, and Kite doesn't actually die at all. He did it for nothing, paid absolutely everything, and then Killua just comes in and magically heals him. It's one thing that really bothers me about the story. I feel like Gon didn't suffer enough, but I can't say I'm not happy for him, because I really do love Gon as a character, and I'm always really happy to see him recover from that state, but I feel like it makes the story a bit too lenient with its main character plot armor, because that is definitely a situation where you could easily just remove one of your main characters, but instead Togashi goes down the route of magically healing him. It is kind of an introduction to the Dark Continent abilities and what is actually possible in the world, but it still feels like a massive cop-out of writing his character into a bad situation and then just zapping it away. And you can argue that him losing Nen is the payment for it all, but I'm just saying it's not outside of the realm of possibilities that he's going to re-obtain Nen at some point, just like Corollo did. It's obviously not the same situation, as Gon's is completely different and a lot more severe, whereas Corollo was just kind of sealed off. But is it like actually that different? And even if he doesn't end up getting any of his Nen abilities back, he still seems pretty fine without it for now. Like, he basically cheated death and just got a slap on the wrist and told to sit out for a while things take a different direction in the story. But like, I do really love Gon, and I don't want anything bad to ever happen to him, which fully contradicts what I'm saying, but I feel like he really should have had something more severe. Like, when his arm got removed, you could just leave that arm off and he could go through the rest of his life with one arm. That would be a more justified punishment in my head than no Nen for now, because like, he really got away with so much for what he has to live with now. But like, he is still a child and has gone through so many things in the last year or two. Like, I can give it a pass, but the more I look at it, the more I want him to be punished more. But that just sounds awful to say. But it makes it seem like these Nen restrictions that they put on themselves to obtain power are just meaningless, if you can just find a way to skirt around the rules and nullify every bit of it. At least with the Nen Exorcist people, they still had to deal with the consequences of lifting someone else's Nen. This seems like just a snap of the fingers and you're good to go. It just feels like a really lazy and extremely convenient solution to all of their problems. Just having Aluka like sitting on the sideline waiting for someone to mess up so they can be healed immediately. I don't necessarily think that it's bad, but I just wish there would have been a little more consequences to the situation before moving on so quickly. Maybe something will come up later with Gon or Killua when they're shown again, because despite being the predominantly main characters, up until this point, they haven't really been shown at all since the Succession War started. The only thing that's really been shown has been Gon dealing with the fact that he has lost his Nen and talking to his dad about it. But they've taken more of a backseat, and it's more of Kurapika and Leorio's time to shine, even though it's been mostly just Kurapika. That is one thing that has annoyed me thus far about the Succession War. It started off with Leorio, but he was more of just a stepping stone to get Kurapika involved in everything. And I'm not the biggest Leorio fan, but I would like to see more stories involving him specifically, and they haven't really shown anything of him from the moment that Kurapika was introduced back into the story. But taking it back to even like in the York New City arc, it was very much like Kurapika's off doing his own thing and everyone else is doing their own thing. And there hasn't really been that type of arc for Leorio at all. Everything's kind of following in the other directions, and he's just a side character bouncing between them as support. I guess for his character it makes sense because he doesn't really have any massive attachments to anything right now, apart from becoming a doctor. So I'm assuming at least when they get to the Dark Continent, maybe it'll be a bit more split between him and everyone else. As of right now, there just hasn't been much Leorio content. And I mean, he's not my favorite character, that obviously Hisoka, but it would be nice to see more of Leorio as a actual main character rather than just a side character of the main characters, if that makes any sense. And I mean, technically he was like the main character of the election part and immediately after as they're preparing to go to the Dark Continent, but those were extremely small moments where we didn't really get much of actual content from him specifically, and it was more of just a segue into the next thing. But I guess there isn't really a bunch of things that he can actively do right now. Hopefully when they reach the Dark Continent, there will be more medical issues and discoveries that he can take more of a lead with. I think that'd be really cool to put more of a spotlight on his character specifically. He's one of the main four that we just haven't had much time to spend with yet. And with each chapter, it feels like we're just being introduced to more and more characters as time goes on. And it's just a small thing that annoys me with the series overall, but specifically with the Succession War, is just the sheer amount of characters that are being introduced. Like, I struggle to remember half of the characters in normal series, and it feels like every couple chapters, we're just bombarded with brand new characters, from guards of the princes, or new mafia members, or just people in the ship in general. It's just a bit overwhelming with the amount of characters that have been introduced from this one arc. But that's been a thing with the entire series up until this point, where every single new arc just feels like a completely different story, with a bunch of brand new characters and a bunch of brand new topics to delve into. It keeps the story really fresh constantly, but it also just feels like you're reading a different story every single arc. Like, to have the story start off with the Hunter exam as like an introduction into the world and the characters, making it seem like it's going to be mostly a fairly standard adventure story, but then it all shifts into the 1v1 battle tournament story arc, and then into this mafia auction thing, moving into the video game isekai-esque thing, and then going into this monster war, and then an election while simultaneously saving a friend. And now the story's transitioned into a battle royale of this royal family of a nation that we've heard nothing about up until this point, and it's probably going to end up moving into the Dark Continent, where it's going to be an exploration arc. And I do really like it, but it constantly feels like moving into different stories every single time. I'm pretty sure that's how it was meant to be written, because it just kind of follows along with what Togashi wants to write about, which is just amazing in general that he's been able to actually do that successfully, and it's really cool. But each time they have to make things feel bigger and badder and just on another level entirely. So they're constantly evolving the power system and just making everything have more devastating consequences with it, but then you have to introduce all of this new information every single arc, and it kind of feels like it's overloading the reader with too much information almost. And with a series like this, it makes more sense having the bigger exposition dumps, because there's so much going on and so many different things you need to follow along with. But genuinely, like, some of these pages are just filled entirely with text. It's almost like you're reading an entire book, and sometimes I just really want to look at pretty pictures. Like, there's genuinely more words in chapter 388 than some entire manga volumes have. And I'm not trying to say that it's a bad thing, but there's definitely a balance between text and art that just feels a bit off throughout the Succession War. And I mean, that probably does fall into the category of personal preference, but when you have entire pages that look like this, I feel like it's a bit much. But despite there being so much dialogue and text, like, there's genuinely just so many moving parts to this arc that sometimes it's a bit overwhelming, but every bit of it is really interesting. Like, there's so many different things going on at the same time. You have the spiders dealing with the mafia, you have the mafia in general just dealing with each other, and you have all of the princes trying to learn Nen and get an upper hand over the other ones in this battle to the death. And not to mention, you have the Hunters organization trying its best to keep the peace throughout the entire ordeal, at least until they get to their destination. So the story itself is just constantly getting more and more intricate and convoluted. Like, the most recent chapter at the time of recording, they've completely gone into a backstory about the Phantom trope and seeing them as children and how they got to the point where they're at, I'm assuming. But it's almost like you're watching like 15 different storylines that are all converging in the exact same moment. And it's just really interesting to see how it evolves over time. And since I brought up the spiders, there's just a lot of content with them that I'm really enjoying right now, because they've taken more of a like main character status in the story. So it's like back in the York New City, where we could see things from their perspective and see their mentality over the situation and everything. And we're getting that a lot more with their entire involvement in the ship and hunting down Hisoka and whatnot. Which, I mean, come on, like, Hisoka against the entire Phantom Troop is probably one of my favorite parts of the post-anime content. Specifically, the fight between Hisoka and Corolla was one of the greatest, like, fight scenes that I have ever read. Leading up to me actually reading it, I did have prior knowledge to the whole situation. Like, I knew they fought, and I did watch a couple videos, like, breaking down the fight a little, but that was completely different than actually sitting down and reading it, because I don't think, like, any video that I've actually seen on it does it justice. There's just so much that actually happens in that fight to break down. I don't really want to say that any of the videos that I watched did a bad job breaking it down, because they're all very good videos on their own, but actually sitting down and reading it panel by panel is just a completely different experience, which is extremely obvious now that I'm thinking about it. But like, I guess I didn't really expect it to be that much better, but it was. I don't really feel like sitting here and describing the entirety of the events that happened, but specifically seeing Corolla and Hisoka both evolving from the last time we saw them just makes me feel all sorts of happy. I don't want to say that they're the two best characters in the story, but let's be honest, they're probably the two best characters in the story. And the last time we actually saw Corolla, he was not in a good position, having his Nen sealed and everything, but coming back with new Nen abilities was something I didn't really expect. And then obviously Hisoka's death and then post-mortem revival was probably one of the coolest moments of the story, in my opinion. I don't really know what it is about Hisoka that I love so much, but he's just one of the best characters ever. Actually, I think all of the spiders are really good characters, but I think it might have something to do with just the level of mystery that surrounds them all. Because up until 395, there hasn't really been like any big amount of backstory with them, apart from the fact that they're from Meteor City and just a bunch of little tidbits from like the York New City arc. But they're just characters that kind of show up, do their thing, and then leave. There was never like any build up to them, like in terms of developing their characters or anything. They were already full-fledged out characters when they were introduced. But now with 395 and probably the next few chapters moving forward, I feel like there's going to be more of an emphasis on their backstory and how they came to be who they actually are. Because right before it shifted into this like backstory bit, I think it was Nobunaga was talking about losing a comrade having a large impact on them and basically forcing them to search for their purpose in life. And then it went into more of a backstory about them being these innocent children, and I'm assuming the events that lead up to them becoming the actual characters that we know and love. It was pretty weird seeing Corolla being like a completely different child than what I had expected. Like, I expected him to be a lot more of a like hardened child and not as friendly and willing to dub TV shows for his friends. And he definitely didn't seem like the leader type at that moment. It seemed like more of a side character type vibe. And then just to know what type of character he turns into, I'm really looking forward to where this arc's going. I know I complained about not having Leorio content earlier in the video, but like, having the Phantom Trope's backstory, I think this is a good trade-off. And I'm willing to wait just a bit longer on Leorio. And also Ging and Beyond and Pariston. None of those characters have really done anything. They were introduced into the story just to kind of sit on the sideline for a bit. I mean, it is what it is. I'm assuming that we'll get more involvement from them in the later chapters, hopefully. Especially with Beyond. I feel like he'll be one of the biggest wrenches that gets thrown into this entire ordeal. Because it was heavily implied that he's got some secret, not so secret involvement going on behind the scenes. I'm really curious to see what his actual involvement will be. But part of me kind of hopes he just up and disappears the moment they make landfall, just because it would be such a random thing to happen that I think it would catch most people off guard. It would be kind of perfect for him. Like, his entire goal was to get back to the Dark Continent, and then he gets there just to abandon everyone. I think it'd be funny. But I mean, more than likely, he's gonna have a much bigger part of the story. But hey, it's a thought. But back to like the actual succession war, I don't really have a lot of opinions on what's going on between the princes and whatnot. Like, I can't even remember any of their actual names. But they're all extremely unique with different personalities, and the older ones are a lot more violence oriented with a lot more emphasis on control and actually being leaders and taking over through whatever means necessary. And the younger ones are a lot more chill, and well, they're basically just children. But all of the legitimate heirs are basically forced into this death battle that only one can realistically come out of, because they've already had a couple try and escape, and with their Nen Beast, there's probably some restrictions on that. More than likely they're not going to be able to escape, but when they make landfall, I don't know how that'll change. As far as the individual princes go, only a few of them actually stand out to me enough to remember like personalities and stuff. Specifically with like the first prince is pretty cool. He's a lot more military focused and like strength based, I guess. The third prince seems a lot more like intellectually based, which is kind of interesting if he's going to end up being like more of a background character manipulating things. I also really like the 10th and 11th princes, but I'm not entirely sure where that whole thing is going right now, with the one being impersonated by a Nen Beast, I think. And I think that the 14th prince is actually one of the strongest competitors in this entire event, despite being a literal baby, especially with Kurapika being his head guard right now and kind of manipulating everything into his favor. But I have a feeling that the baby's a bit more interesting, and the mother's going to try extremely hard to at least survive. I almost completely forgot to talk about the 9th prince. He definitely wasn't my favorite character to start with, but he grew on me a lot over time with his devotion to ending this whole conflict and moving towards peacefully resolving everything with as many survivors as possible. But halfway through the arc, he's changed a lot and he's become a lot more aggressive once he's like accepted the role, and his Nen Beast has proven that like he can't really avoid his destiny, which brought forth his Nen ability, which is kind of terrifying. And seeing how he's going to interact with everyone else around him in the upcoming like banquets and stuff, that's really interesting. And the last prince that I really like is obviously the 4th prince. He's just absolutely psychotic, and he's probably going to be one of the greatest antagonists of the story. I think thus far he's been pretty amazing in one of those terrifying ways. It's definitely leading up to him taking on Kurapika, as they're both specialists, and they're probably, I don't want to say they're evenly matched, but they probably have the best matchup out of like all of the Nen users currently aboard the ship, in my opinion, because there's just so many things that Kurapika's been able to do with his new abilities that he's shown, going against the prince's ability to basically control his own future. I feel like this is going to be one of the greatest fights that could possibly happen. But there's always a possibility that other people get involved, and maybe even the spiders come in and completely change the dynamic of what's going to happen. That's another thing too. I really want to see how Kurapika reacts to the spiders being aboard the ship, because as far as he's aware, they're not, and he's solely focused on his mission, which is to protect the 14th prince. So I'm really curious to see what sort of direction he'll be pulled in once he finds out the spiders are there. I don't think he actually cares about them all that much right now though, considering he has the eyes apart from the ones that the 4th prince has. So he's kind of tunnel visioned into them, and I'm assuming he's not going to care as much about the spiders, but also considering they're the reason why he has to get the eyes, it might be a bit interesting what happens with that. Maybe we even get a Hisoka Kurapika team up again. That'd be pretty cool. That was fun. But it's all just really interesting. I wasn't sure about the Succession War at first, but after actually getting into it and catching up and reading it weekly now, there's just so much that's really interesting about everything going on. From watching everything happen with the princes and how their dynamics shift and change as more and more of them drop like flies, with all of their increasing Nen abilities and all the new introductions to random characters every single chapter, mixed with all of the random mafia members getting murdered by some serial killer on board who's currently dead, but there's also multiple other ones from this other mafia family, while the other mafia families try and corner that one and eliminate them with the help of the spiders. And there's just so much going on. I love every bit of it, but there is a tremendous amount of text, which is my only major gripe about the series currently. But I am definitely looking forward to more of it. But this was a bit of a different video than what I have been making, so let me know what you think about it. Anyway, thanks for watching.